slide down front so you can't see there's no fucking body there.
First time ever on Reality Check. What's up?
What's happening, man? What's going on?
Johnny, yeah.
I wanted to know if you wanted to audition, Rachel Bowen. It was that simple, man.
So bring us up to speed. You guys got a new record on the way, I saw.
August 5th, new record, Skid Row record drops in stores, and it's the first one with Johnny on it.
The best one.
The first one with our new drummer, Phil. And so, yeah, we're really excited about it, man.
What's it called?
Thick Skin.
Snake's moving out of his house.
What kind of pressure was it you stepping in?
It was very, very easy.
Part maybe I don't like it so much, so the tension builds. I hate it.
Hey everyone, welcome back to part 3 of The Decline of Skid Row, a series where I've been delving into the band's past history in order to find out the reasons why they fell from the top. In my last video, I covered Slave to the Grind, Subhuman Race, and the end of the Sebastian Bach era. One mistake that I made was that I left out Wasted Time when I was showing their music videos. There was so much to cover, so much I wanted to say that it just slipped my mind, and by the time it was brought to my attention, it was too late to go back and correct it. So let's fix that issue now, because Wasted Time is one hell of a music video. Both the song and the video is about drug use and the effect it was having on the youth at that time. It was groundbreaking in its message, and it was one of their single releases. It charted at 88 on the Billboard Hot 100 during the peak of the band's fame, and it is another example of the band's overall talent. Sebastian's vocals really shine through on this particular track as well. Skid Row in the 90s had reached the height of their fame with a #1 album, but in that same decade also lost that fame and had broken apart due to changes in the music industry and tension in the band. Gone were the stadiums, gone were the #1 hits, and gone was Skid Row. But at the tail end of the 90s, Skid Row decided to return, without Sebastian and without Rob. Rachel, Snake and Scotty decided that Skid Row was far too important to them to let die, so they began searching for a new singer. That singer was from Fort Worth in Texas, and his name was Johnny Solinger. Before joining Skid Row, Solinger was an independent artist trying to make his own mark on the world of music. Solinger had released a bunch of country rock solo albums independently, which aren't bad at all if you're into that sort of thing. For drums, they recruited Phil Varone, the ex-drummer of the band Saigon Kick. Once Skid Row had their new singer and drummer, they began working on their new album, Thick Skin. There was a movie called Under the Skin, The Making of Thick Skin, which documents the time they took making and releasing the album, which honestly I just found painful to watch. One of the few highlights of the movie was seeing Skid Row introduce us to their new singer and drummer, and seeing how their new dynamic worked. Or didn't. We see Dave Sabo move out of his home, most likely because he had to downsize on account of not being paid the big bucks he used to get from touring stadiums. Most of the movie is spent on what seems like a whole bunch of nothing, hopping from one studio to another, and a lot of drinking and time wasting while struggling to produce a decent album. Thick Skin was rehearsed at Sabo's house, recorded at John Bon Jovi's personal studio, then it was scrapped and redone at Shorefire Studios. The movie definitely is an interesting insight into the shape of Skid Row at that moment in time, but I honestly just found the whole thing kinda sad. Bringing Skid Row back into the mainstream was going to be next to impossible, because moving into the 2000s, the music industry had changed it up yet again. Bands like Skid Row were now being pigeonholed onto classic rock radio stations that were only interested in playing their old material. Rock music in general was no longer part of the mainstream charts anymore. Now it had its own charts separate from the mainstream that only rock stations would play from. MTV by that point barely showed any metal music. Headbangers Ball had unfortunately long since been cancelled. Now it was all about TRL and the slow transition into reality TV. Rock 104 in my country had long since ditched the rock in their name in favour of the pop charts, so there was little to no medium for real rock bands anymore. Unless you were from a middle class family that had a satellite subscription for Kerrang and VH1, the channels that did support bands like Skid Row, you weren't going to see anything that resembled real rock and roll. Broadband, YouTube, and streaming services were still a few years away, so if you wanted to discover rock music, you had to go to a music shop like Virgin, HMV or Soundseller. You had to see what bands were making it into the magazines, or find the local hippie rocker dude in your area that had a collection of music and knowledge that was willing to recommend good bands to you, or visit your neighbour who had a PC with access to dial-up internet and a program like Winamx or Napster to give you the music that wasn't available in the stores. Because not every record was freely available like it is today. It was a fucking treasure hunt, and it cost money, 15 to 30 euro an album, a fortune for a young teenager, and people complain about Spotify raising their prices. I myself didn't discover Skid Row till I was 18 because of how limited my access was to this kind of music, so it's safe to say, without major label backing, Skid Row wasn't going to reach new fans like myself, and even if they somehow managed to make it into the rock charts, they were competing in a new era of music. Emo, pop punk, the heaviest of metal and nu metal was now king shit on the hill in rock circles. And as for the mainstream charts, the closest you were getting to anything that sounded like rock and roll was either Busted or Avril Lavigne. So if they were even going to make a dent, they had to prove their worth all over again and produce something of quality. Keep in mind, when Skid Row broke up the first time, the internet wasn't what it was today. No one had a social media profile to keep you posted on what was going on with the band, and MTV had all but erased classic rock. They hadn't shown a video in years. So when Skid Row were gone, they were gone. Thick Skin was released on August 5th, 2003, and it bombed really badly. Skid Row proceeded to make all the wrong moves moving forward, and in my opinion completely missed the mark. The whole process of putting the band back together and producing Thick Skin took 3 years. In a desperate attempt to stay current, they completely watered down their sound and ended up sounding like a cross between Creed and Nickelback with elements of nu metal, all while looking like some sort of punk southern rock group. It didn't make any sense. Thick Skin was a mess. Some songs were perfectly radio friendly, while others sounded grungy. There are some okay songs on the album like Ghost and Born a Beggar, but none of these songs met the standard for a Skid Row album. For a band that had released 3 amazing albums previously, in terms of quality, production, songwriting, on Thick Skin, it just isn't there. It's all awful in comparison, especially to their previous records. I Remember You Too is pure blasphemy, especially if you're a diehard Skid Row fan. It's not a Skid Row record. None of it is even remotely familiar. Your next album should always be as good as or better than your last, and Thick Skin just didn't measure up. A majority of old school Skid Row fans felt alienated. Who was the target audience for this album? It's really hard to tell. Their single Ghost sounds like something Creed would have released. A New Generation sounds like a Marilyn Manson ripoff. Johnny is a decent enough singer, and live he's pretty good, but his attitude was awful. He seemed to be under the delusion at the time that he was superior to Beck, but just look at him. He looks like a lad who was picked straight out of the dole queue to audition. One of those bullshit, balding at the front, still lives with his parents' rockers, runs on a diet of booze and bad food. You know the type I'm on about. You ever see the film The Rocker? Yeah, that's Solinger. Replacing an iconic frontman is tough. Crash Diet, for example, had 4 different singers, but it worked every time because they're the real deal. Singers with great range that are in good shape that respect the last guy that came before them. But Solinger, however, didn't. Thick Skin came and went within a week, peaking at 46 on the charts with no number 1s and no top 10 hits. Thick Skin was an independent release with no major label backing. It had 2 videos to promote the album, and I'm not even sure if they were played on any mainstream TV station. The only TV exposure they seemed to get at the time was interviews on Who Gives a Fuck TV stations no one's heard of, and interviews on classic rock radio stations. I'm really not trying to be an arsehole here, but this really wasn't the best time for Skid Row. Although Skid Row still managed to play stadiums again, they were no longer headliners. They were openers, riding the coattails of their rock star friends, continuing to slip down the ladder. They did, however, join Kiss on their first farewell tour in 2000, which is still pretty cool, but other than that, it seemed to be all downhill from there. By the time it came for a follow-up album, Phil Varone was out and a guy named Dave Garrett took over drumming duties. Their follow-up to Thick Skin, Revolutions Per Minute, is even worse. Just take a look at that album cover. Take it all in. It's a fucking wheel rim. What were they thinking? When I look at it, it doesn't get me excited to listen to it. I don't equate a wheel rim with rock and roll. My mind instantly jumps to Pimp My Ride, X to the Z, and some lad's shit heap of a car getting fixed. Not anything rock and roll comes to mind when I look at it. In fact, the more I look at it, the more it makes me want to throw it out a window and not listen to it. I'm just trying to picture how the band meeting went when they were thinking up ideas for the cover. Someone actually had to take a look at that. Someone looked at that and went, a wheel. That's bloody brilliant. Approve that right now. It's so uninspiring, but never judge a book by its cover, right? It's more or less the same level of quality Thick Skin measured up to. In fact, it's a bit worse. It was released on October 24th, 2006 and bombed even worse than Thick Skin. There are some okay songs on it, but it's still not up to the standard of the back catalogue. Despite bringing back Michael Wagner to produce the album, it got mostly negative reviews and only charted in Japan. The most attention I'd say it would have received by that point would have been plays from the now defunct social media platform MySpace. Overall, it's worse than Thick Skin, and it didn't even have any music videos. In my opinion, Skid Row didn't return to form until United World Rebellion Chapter 1 came out in 2013. The lineup of the band had changed once again. David Garrett departed in 2010 and Rob Hammersmith replaced him as their drummer. Despite this though, United World Rebellion hit the nail on the head for me. It was everything I wanted it to be. That was the Skid Row I loved. They had brought back their hard rock sound with a great concept and a good EP cover. I loved it. The problem was, what the hell were they thinking releasing it the way they did? Instead of releasing it as a full album, they decided to split the album up into EPs and release it in stages, a few songs at a time. We got United World Rebellion Chapter 1 on April 16th, 2013, and Rise of the Damnation Army United World Rebellion Chapter 2 on August 5th, 2014. Why not release the whole thing at once? Maybe it was to create some sort of hype, but I myself was sick of waiting. I finally got to see them live in Dublin in 2013, the year they released Chapter 1, and it wasn't in a stadium but a small academy-sized venue. It was packed for sure, but that was because they co-headlined with Ugly Kid Joe. It was a great gig, it was just a shame that they couldn't play the Tree Arena like they did back in the day. Solinger and Skid Row parted ways in 2015. He was replaced by Tony Harnell, ex-singer of TNT, but he only stuck around for 8 months. He was then replaced by Mr. ZP Theart in 2016. I hope I'm saying that right. ZP is the ex-singer of the power metal group Dragon Force. Finally, Skid Row had a decent singer who looked and performed like a rock star. I know my opinion is going to be unpopular, but if anyone was the perfect fit or replacement for Back, it was this guy. And he's the guy that stuck around right up to present day. He's cool as fuck, he's got the range, but most importantly, he respects the band he is in, the fans and the legacy, because he is a fan himself. In more recent times, Dave Sabo has released his own signature guitar. Both Scotty and Snake have done videos for Gibson and interviews with various YouTubers, and Rachel has his own brand of soap. And I imagine once the world gets going again, so will Skid Row. So what killed Skid Row's arena star status? The answer is complicated, and none of the throwaway answers people have mentioned over the years, like they're not performing with Back, or it was Nirvana's fault, or any other generic response I've heard on their own, make a lot of sense to me. And after looking through their history myself, here's the answers that I think make the most sense. It was a combination of everything. The inner tensions between Back and the band itself didn't help. Releasing 2, let's be honest, crap albums after Back was kicked out also didn't help. But really what it was their fans aged out. There is always the Metal for Life dudes like myself who are devoted to always being a part of the rock and roll community, the guys who keep up with what's happening with their favourite bands, the diehards, which I think account for about 10% of the people who would have been at the stadium gigs back in the day. Then there's the people who like rock music but have moved on, had families, got jobs, and didn't have time to keep up, and didn't give enough of a shit about music in general to check up on whatever happened to Skid Row until seeing a video like this one. And that's your 60%. And the remaining 30% got into more extreme music like Machine Head, Pantera, Nirvana, Dream Theater, and so on, because that was the cool, new, exciting thing happening in metal after Slave. Everyone goes through different phases in their life. My favourite bands of all time have changed a few times over since I was 18. Think about it. When I was 13, Marilyn Manson was everything. Then it was Guns N' Roses, then it was Pretty Boy Floyd, then it was Skid Row, and so on and so on. Also, Skid Row no longer had major label backing and radio play on mainstream stations anymore. So there hasn't been enough exposure to a sizable audience of new and young rockers to replace the ones that have moved on. Every opportunity that they had to make things right with back, they pissed away, which is unfortunate. Because having an original lineup back together would have created hype, it would have gotten labels interested, and it would have gotten them enough exposure to maybe, just maybe, fill a stadium again. Skid Row and Sebastian slamming each other in the rock press over sites like Metal Sludge and Blabbermouth, whether it was bullshit tweets or a clip from a video somewhere where someone said something, it all didn't help matters, and the older these guys get, the less people are going to give a fuck about a reunion. I think the window of opportunity for a reunion has come and gone, and it's sad. So overall, that's what I think killed off one of the biggest bands on the planet. In my next video, I'm going to cover Sebastian's solo career, because he's had one hell of a solo career, and he also deserves to have his story told as well. Thanks so much for watching the video. If you liked it, leave me a comment, and if you want to see more, subscribe to the channel, it helps me out a lot. Be sure to click that poxy bell icon